This story is titled, Your Girlfriend is a High-Paid Surgeon While You're Just Service Staff, my father sneered. So I disappeared for years and returned wealthy and successful, leaving everyone speechless. Sup Reddit, my name is Tyler, I'm 26 years old, and I've got a friendly public service announcement for anyone out there dealing with family drama. If you're going to treat one of your kids like absolute garbage while worshiping the other one like they walk on water, maybe make sure the disappointing one isn't secretly building a real estate empire behind your back. My parents learned this lesson the hard way. And boy, was it satisfying to watch everything unfold. I've been getting shit from my family since basically forever. My parents never even tried to hide the fact that they had a favorite kid. And spoiler alert, it wasn't me. Growing up, it was always Diana got straight A's again. And Diana got into the honors program. Meanwhile, my report cards barely got a glance from either of them. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't a bad student by any means. I maintained solid B's with some A's mixed in. But I wasn't the academic superstar my sister was destined to become. I was more of a hands-on guy, the type who learned by doing rather than memorizing. While Diana was buried in biology textbooks and flashcards, I was the kid taking apart old computers and rebuilding them from scratch, or helping our neighbor fix his deck to earn some cash on weekends. I genuinely enjoyed working with my hands and solving practical problems, but my parents saw this as a clear sign that I lacked ambition or intelligence. My dad, Robert, was always obsessed with status and appearances. He worked as a mid-level manager at some corporate office, constantly talking about getting a promotion that never seemed to materialize no matter how hard he tried. The guy literally had a whole collection of motivational posters hanging in his home office. You know the type, with words like persistence and excellence printed over scenic mountain views. The irony wasn't lost on me that he'd been stuck in the same position for like a decade, but he still acted like he was climbing some corporate ladder. My mom worked as a high school teacher and spent most of her time bragging about her gifted daughter to anyone who would listen at work. Meanwhile, I was the kid who got a distracted, "That's nice, honey," when I won the school's woodworking competition. Not even a congratulations or a moment of genuine interest, just a half-hearted acknowledgement before they immediately went back to discussing Diana's latest academic achievement. The contrast in their reactions was so stark that even I started to internalize the message that what I did simply didn't matter. When college time rolled around, the disparity in treatment became even more obvious. Diana got into this fancy private university with a partial scholarship, and my parents moved heaven and earth to make it happen for her. They took out loans, drained their savings account, and did whatever it took to send their golden child to her dream school. I found out years later that they even remortgaged the house to cover her expenses, which gives you an idea of how committed they were to her success. When it was my turn 2 years later, the conversation was drastically different. Community college has perfectly fine programs, they told me matter-of-factly. You can work to pay for it yourself. The message was received loud and clear. Diana was worth going into debt for, but I was expected to figure things out on my own. Looking back, this was actually one of the best things that ever happened to me, though I didn't realize it at the time. The day Diana officially got that doctor title in front of her name changed everything in our household dynamic. She walked into our parents' house waving her diploma and her offer letter from some fancy hospital like she'd just won the lottery. From that exact moment, I basically stopped existing to them, except as a convenient punching bag for their frustrations. My parents had never really tried to hide their favoritism before. But after that day, they didn't just favor her. They started actively treating me like garbage. I still remember this one family dinner that perfectly encapsulated how toxic things had become. My dad looked directly at me across the table and said, with complete seriousness, "She's a doctor saving lives, and you're just scanning items at Home Depot." I just stared at him, thinking to myself, who the hell says something like that to their own son? But apparently, he wasn't finished destroying my self-esteem for the evening. He leaned back in his chair with this smug expression, looked me dead in the eye and said, "Honestly, Tyler, if Diana didn't exist, we'd have no one to be proud of. At least one of our kids turned out to be worth something." He didn't even flinch or show a moment of regret, just kept cutting into his steak like he hadn't just called his own son completely worthless with his whole chest. The casual cruelty of it was almost impressive in its thoroughness. My mom thought this was absolutely hilarious. She laughed so hard she had to wipe tears from her eyes, then chimed in with, "Don't be so dramatic, Tyler. He just means we can't exactly brag about someone who stocks shelves for a living." The way she said it, like I was being overly sensitive for being hurt by their words, made the whole situation even more surreal. Diana didn't even try to stop them or defend me in any way. In fact, she seemed to genuinely enjoy the show. She just sat there with this smug little smile on her face, casually sipping her sparkling water like she was too refined and sophisticated for the rest of us. I kept thinking about how I'd fixed her laptop for free just the week before when she'd spilled coffee all over the keyboard. Funny how my supposedly useless technical skills were suddenly valuable when she needed them. But the rest of the time I was treated like the family failure. After that dinner, ripping into me became their favorite family pastime. Every holiday gathering, every birthday celebration, every random Sunday dinner, it didn't matter what the occasion was. If I ever mentioned anything about my job or what I was working on, my parents would immediately roll their eyes in unison. My mom would say something like, "Maybe someday you'll do something that actually matters," while my dad would just sigh dramatically and shake his head like I was a hopeless case. The worst part of this whole dynamic was what I called their family achievement wall in the hallway. They had created this shrine to Diana's accomplishments that featured about 20 framed photos of her graduating from medical school, getting her first white coat, standing with various important doctors at hospital events, and receiving different awards. And buried among all of Diana's glory was literally one photo of me, my high school graduation picture. I swear they only included it because my grandparents had called them out for not having any pictures of me displayed anywhere in the house. Diana's ego and sense of superiority only got worse over time. She started calling me Tyler the minimum wager in front of our extended family during gatherings, then would add with a laugh, "You should put that on your name tag at work." When she bought her brand new Audi, my parents wouldn't shut up about it for months, constantly asking me when I planned to upgrade from that beater I drove. For the record, I drive a 2011 Toyota Corolla that runs perfectly fine and has never given me any major problems. When she bought her fancy condo, they immediately started asking when I was going to stop living like a broke college kid. When she went on expensive vacations to Europe, they'd remind me that people with real careers get to travel and see the world. The constant comparisons became exhausting, but I learned to just tune them out most of the time. One Thanksgiving, my dad literally gave me a book called From Mediocrity to Success, Finding Your Path as my actual present in front of the entire extended family. My uncle nearly choked on his stuffing when he saw what was happening, but my parents seemed completely oblivious to how inappropriate and hurtful their behavior was. They genuinely thought they were being helpful or motivational, which somehow made it even worse. I tried different approaches over the years to deal with this toxic family dynamic. Sometimes I stayed quiet and just took whatever abuse they dished out. Other times, I tried defending myself and explaining my perspective. I even tried skipping family visits altogether for a while, hoping they'd realize how their behavior was pushing me away. But nothing ever changed the fundamental pattern. The second I walked through their front door, I was immediately back to being their favorite target for criticism and disappointment. The only people in my family who ever stood up for me were my grandparents, Frank and Grace. My grandpa Frank was a straight shooter who didn't tolerate bullshit from anyone, including his own son. After one particularly nasty comment from my dad during a family dinner, Grandpa told him firmly to back off, saying, "That boy works harder than you know, Robert. Maybe you should pay attention instead of running your mouth." My dad just scoffed dismissively and said, "We're only teasing him, Dad. He knows we don't mean anything by it." My grandma Grace had a gentler approach, but she was just as supportive in her own way. She would always pull me aside during family gatherings and tell me she was proud of me no matter what path I chose in life. "You don't need anyone's permission to be successful, Tyler," she'd whisper to me. "Just keep being yourself." While her words meant the world to me, they didn't change the overall toxic dynamic that had taken root in our family. My grandpa was actually the only person who ever really understood who I was at my core. He had been a carpenter his entire working life, building things with his hands just like I enjoyed doing. He used to tell me, "Some people build with their minds, others build with their hands. Both types build the world we live in, and both are equally important." When I was 12 years old, he gave me my first real tool set and spent countless hours showing me how to fix things instead of just throwing them away and buying replacements. Those skills and that mindset turned out to be way more valuable than anyone in my family could have possibly realized at the time. Meanwhile, Diana remained the untouchable golden child in my parents' eyes. I continued to be the disappointment they constantly wished would finally grow up and amount to something meaningful. What none of them knew was that I had been quietly building something significant on the side, completely under their radar. About 3 years ago, I had scraped together enough money for a down payment on a rundown duplex in a decent neighborhood. I spent my weekends fixing it up myself. New flooring, updated plumbing, fresh paint, the whole 9 yards. Once I got both units renovated and rented out, I used that steady rental income to leverage my way into another property, and then another one after that. It was a slow process, but each property I acquired made the next one easier to finance. I never told my family about any of this real estate business I was building. What was the point? They would have just found some way to make it about Diana, or dismissed it as another one of my foolish schemes that would inevitably fail. Plus, I had learned over the years that keeping my accomplishments to myself was often the safest strategy when dealing with people who were determined to see me as a failure. The only person who knew the real me and what I was actually working toward was my girlfriend Zoe. She's been my biggest supporter and cheerleader through this entire journey. Zoe is quiet and incredibly smart, with an almost supernatural ability to see right through people's bullshit and facades. I had never brought her around to meet my family because I knew exactly what kind of reception she'd get from them. My mom would probably ask her when she was planning to get a real job instead of working at a bookstore, or make some snide comment about how Diana had once dated a neurosurgeon. But Zoe has been my rock through all of this family drama. She knows everything about my situation, sees everything clearly, and has never once asked me to prove myself to her or justify my choices. She accepts me exactly as I am, which was something I'd never experienced from my own family. One night after a particularly brutal family dinner where my dad had suggested I should shadow Diana at the hospital to see what real work actually looks like, Zoe helped me realize something important about the whole dynamic. "You know why your parents' approval matters so much to your sister?" she asked me thoughtfully. "Because she doesn't have anything else in her life. No real friends, no hobbies, no identity outside of being the successful daughter they can brag about. You have a whole life they know nothing about, and that's actually your power." She was absolutely right, and that power was about to become very, very real in ways none of them could have imagined. About 2 years into Diana's reign as the undisputed family royalty, little cracks started showing in her perfect facade. At first, it was just small things that most people probably wouldn't have noticed. She started canceling family visits more frequently, and her phone calls with my parents became noticeably shorter and less enthusiastic than they used to be. Then at Thanksgiving dinner that year, she mentioned almost casually that her husband Kevin couldn't make it to join us because of some work-related obligations. My parents immediately jumped into defense mode, explaining to anyone who would listen how important and demanding Kevin's job as a marketing coordinator was, while shooting me pointed looks across the table like they were saying, "Unlike some people at this table who have no real responsibilities." What Diana conveniently didn't tell them was that Kevin had actually moved out of their place 3 weeks earlier. I only found out about this because I ran into him at the gym one evening, and he was clearly upset enough to spill some very personal details to me. "Your sister cares more about your parents' approval than her own happiness," he told me, looking genuinely heartbroken. "I don't think she even realizes she's doing it, but it's destroying everything good in her life." Apparently, Diana had been working such insane hours trying to be the superstar doctor that my parents expected her to be that their marriage had completely fallen apart under the pressure. Kevin said she'd missed anniversaries, birthdays, and even a planned vacation to Italy that they'd already paid for in full. All because she couldn't bear the thought of disappointing her bosses at the hospital, or more importantly, disappointing our parents who lived vicariously through her achievements. I didn't say anything about Kevin's revelation to my family because it wasn't my business to share. And honestly, I wasn't sure they'd even care as long as Diana's career was still intact. But I did start noticing things during family gatherings that I'd missed before. There were designer bags under her eyes that concealer couldn't quite hide. She checked her phone obsessively throughout dinner, like she was constantly waiting for bad news or an emergency call. These were classic signs of someone whose supposedly perfect life was starting to crack at the edges. But my parents were too invested in the image to notice. 3 months later, Diana showed up to my grandparents' anniversary party by herself and announced to the entire family that her divorce was officially final. My parents immediately went into damage control mode, as if Diana's personal life failing was somehow a reflection on their parenting abilities. "These things happen to busy professionals," my mom said, glaring directly at me like I was somehow responsible for my sister's marriage falling apart. "The important thing is that she's accomplished so much professionally before this little setback." My dad nodded in agreement and added, "At least she achieved something meaningful before having to deal with this kind of personal drama." Even in the middle of what should have been a moment of support for Diana, they couldn't resist taking another shot at me and my supposedly meaningless existence. I almost laughed out loud at the absurdity of it all. Only my family could manage to turn Diana's divorce into yet another opportunity to remind me how disappointing I was in comparison. The level of dysfunction was honestly impressive in its consistency. That night, my grandpa pulled me aside privately and said something that stuck with me for a long time afterward. You notice how they never actually ask how you're really doing, Tyler? They don't want to know because they're not interested in the real answer. That's their loss, not yours. You just keep building your life quietly and let them figure out their own problems. The loud ones always burn out first. He had absolutely no idea how prophetic those words would turn out to be. Over the next year, Diana started showing up to family events looking completely exhausted and burned out. The enthusiastic hospital stories that used to dominate every conversation became less frequent and less energetic. She started chugging energy drinks during family dinners just to stay alert, and her hands would shake slightly when she thought no one was looking. My parents either didn't notice these obvious warning signs, or they were deliberately pretending not to see them because acknowledging Diana's struggles would have meant admitting that their golden child wasn't as invincible as they'd convinced themselves she was. They were still too busy using her accomplishments as ammunition against me to pay attention to her actual well-being. "When was the last time you got a promotion at Home Depot?" my mom asked me during Christmas dinner, her voice dripping with that familiar condescension I'd grown so accustomed to over the years. I just shrugged and gave my standard response. "I'm doing all right for myself." "Doing all right isn't the same as actually succeeding at something meaningful," my dad immediately jumped in. "Your sister works 80-hour weeks saving people's lives. That's what real dedication and success look like." I noticed Diana flinch slightly when he mentioned the 80-hour weeks, but she didn't say anything to correct the narrative or admit that those hours were destroying her health and happiness. She just sat there, looking miserable, while our parents used her exhaustion as proof of her superiority over me. I simply nodded and changed the subject to something less controversial, like the weather or sports. What they didn't know was that I had just closed on my fourth property the week before, a small apartment building that had nearly doubled my monthly cash flow. But I kept my mouth shut about it, just like I always did. I'd learned long ago that nothing I accomplished would ever matter to them, so why waste my breath trying to prove myself? There was this one particular day that really crystallized how little my family understood about my life or priorities. I was working on my latest property acquisition, a 4-unit building that needed some serious plumbing work throughout. I was lying under the kitchen sink in one of the units, fixing a stubborn leak that had been causing water damage, when my phone started ringing. It was my dad calling, and he didn't even bother with basic pleasantries like saying hello. "Tyler," he said in that commanding tone he used when he wanted something, "we need you to switch weekends for your grandmother's birthday celebration. Diana has an important medical conference she needs to attend, so we're moving the party to the following weekend instead." Notice how he phrased it, not "can you switch weekends" or "would you be available," but "we need you to." Like my time wasn't valuable and I could just rearrange my entire schedule to accommodate Diana's career obligations yet again. Like I was some kind of on-call backup plan whose only purpose was to be flexible when the important people had conflicts. "Actually, I can't make that work," I said, while tightening a pipe fitting with my wrench. "I've got work commitments that weekend." "Oh, please, Tyler. Home Depot can surely survive one day without you," he scoffed. "It's not like you're running the entire company or anything. You scan barcodes and stock shelves. They can find someone else to cover your shift." I took a deep breath and tried to remain calm. "It's not Home Depot work," I explained. "I have other work commitments that I can't just cancel on short notice." "What other work?" he asked, sounding genuinely confused and slightly annoyed. Like he couldn't possibly imagine me doing anything productive or important outside of my retail job. "What kind of projects could you possibly have that are more important than family?" "Just some renovation projects I'm committed to," I said as vaguely as possible. "I gave my word to people, and I can't back out now." He let out that signature disappointed father sigh that I'd been hearing my entire life. "This is about family, Tyler. I honestly don't understand why you can't be more accommodating and flexible like your sister always is. Diana manages to balance her demanding career with family obligations. Why is that so difficult for you?" I almost told him the truth right then and there. I almost said, "Actually, Dad, I'm in the middle of renovating a property that's going to net me more money this month than you make in 3 months at your corporate job." But I managed to bite my tongue. The timing wasn't right for that conversation, and I knew he wouldn't handle the information well anyway. Zoe came with me to Christmas Eve dinner at my grandparents' house, which was honestly the only family event I actually looked forward to attending anymore. My grandma Grace took to Zoe immediately, pulling me aside later in the evening to whisper, "That girl sees the real you, Tyler. She loves you for who you actually are, not who she thinks you should become. Don't let her go." The funny thing was, my parents had absolutely no clue that Zoe even existed in my life. I had kept those two worlds completely separate for obvious reasons. I knew exactly what kind of reception she'd get from them, and I wasn't about to subject her to their judgment and condescension. Diana was barely holding herself together at that point, though my parents were still completely oblivious to her struggles. She had switched hospitals twice in the past year, constantly complaining about patient loads, administrative bureaucracy, and insurance paperwork nightmares. Every time she tried to express frustration about her work situation, my parents would immediately shut her down with responses like, "But you're making excellent money, honey. That's what really matters in the end." I watched her smile tighten every single time they dismissed her feelings and concerns. I almost felt sorry for her, watching her realize that her emotional well-being meant less to our parents than her ability to maintain their bragging rights about having a successful doctor for a daughter. She started showing up to family gatherings still wearing her scrubs, claiming she didn't have time to go home and change between work and family obligations. Her perfect makeup became non-existent, and her expensive designer clothes got replaced with whatever was comfortable and practical. But my parents were so emotionally invested in maintaining the image of their successful doctor-daughter that they just kept bragging about her to anyone who would listen, completely ignoring the obvious signs that she was burning out. The breaking point came during my dad's 58th birthday dinner. My parents had chosen some ridiculously expensive restaurant for the celebration and spent the entire evening talking excitedly about the European cruise they were planning for later that year. When it came time for my dad to open his presents, Diana handed him an elegant envelope containing first-class flight upgrades for their trip. "Only the best for you guys," she said, with a smile that didn't quite reach her exhausted eyes. "You deserve to travel in comfort and style." Later, when Diana excused herself to go to the bathroom, my mom leaned over toward me with that familiar smug expression and said, "See what a thoughtful, successful daughter does for her family? When are you going to start contributing anything meaningful to this family instead of just taking up space?" I just took a calm sip of my water and replied, "I guess everyone contributes to their family in different ways." My dad snorted dismissively. "Some people contribute a lot more than others, that's for sure." My grandma Grace had overheard this entire exchange, and she said sharply to my mom, "That boy has never asked you for a single dime since he turned 18 years old. Maybe you should think about that before you start keeping score of who's contributing what to this family." My parents just rolled their eyes like my grandma was being overly sentimental, but I noticed that Diana had returned from the bathroom and heard the whole conversation. For the first time ever, I saw something that looked like doubt cross her face as she processed what my grandma had said. That night, I found Diana sitting alone on my parents' back porch, staring off into space like she was trying to solve some impossible puzzle. I almost just walked past her and went home, since we weren't exactly close anymore, and I wasn't sure what to say. But something about her posture made me sit down next to her instead. "You okay?" I asked, genuinely curious about what was going on in her head. She didn't look at me when she answered. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life instead of your own?" It was such an unexpected and vulnerable question that I didn't have an immediate response. I'd never heard Diana sound uncertain about anything in her entire adult life. "Because sometimes," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "I look around at everything I've built and accomplished, and I wonder how I got here. When did I actually decide that this was what I wanted for myself?" "Didn't you always want to be a doctor?" I asked, genuinely curious about her motivations. She shrugged sadly. "I wanted to make Mom and Dad proud of me. Being a doctor seemed like the clearest and most reliable path to earning that approval. Everything else just followed from that initial decision." She finally looked at me directly. "You know what's funny? You're actually the smart one in this family, Tyler." I couldn't help but laugh. "I'm pretty sure that's not what our parents would say about me." "That's exactly my point," she said. "They don't see it because they're not really looking. You figured out early in life that their approval wasn't worth chasing at any cost. I'm just realizing that now, and I've already given up everything that actually mattered to me along the way." Before I could respond to what she'd just shared, my mom called us back inside for birthday cake. Diana immediately plastered on her fake smile and went back to playing the role of the perfect daughter, but something fundamental had shifted between us. I could feel it in the air, and I had a feeling that things were about to change in ways none of us could predict. A few nights later, my phone buzzed close to midnight with an unexpected call. It was Diana, and I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. We didn't usually talk unless someone needed something specific, and late-night calls definitely weren't part of our normal sibling dynamic. But something about this felt different, more urgent than her usual interactions. When I answered, I could immediately tell she was crying, not just sniffling or getting emotional, but full-on sobbing like her world was falling apart. "Tyler, I really fucked up," she choked out between gasps. "I really fucked up everything." This wasn't actually the first time Diana had called me out of the blue asking for help. About 8 months earlier, she had called asking if she could borrow $5,000 for what she described as a temporary cash flow problem. I didn't ask any questions about why she needed the money or what had caused the financial issue. I just sent her the money through a bank transfer and told her to pay me back whenever she could manage it. She never did pay me back, and I never brought it up again. "What's wrong?" I asked, sitting up in bed and trying to focus on her voice. Zoe stirred beside me, opening her eyes with a concerned expression when she heard the distress in my voice. "I lost my job," Diana whispered, like saying the words out loud would make the situation more real and permanent than it already was. 3 months ago. I was silent for a moment, processing what she'd just told me. "Why didn't you tell anyone when it happened? Are you kidding me? Tell Mom and Dad that I completely failed after everything they've invested in me?" Her voice cracked with the weight of that possibility. "I thought I'd be able to find something else quickly, and nobody would ever have to know what happened. I have job applications submitted everywhere, but nothing's coming through, and I'm completely out of options now." "What have you been living on for the past 3 months?" I asked, though I was starting to put the pieces together in my head. That's when the emotional dam completely broke, and through her sobs, she admitted the full scope of how badly her life had spiraled out of control. She'd blown through all of her savings accounts, maxed out every credit card she had access to, and taken desperate loans from friends who were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about when she'd be able to pay them back. Now she was facing eviction from her fancy condo within the next 2 weeks, and her situation was about to become impossible to hide from our parents. Her beloved Audi had already been repossessed last month, though she'd been telling our parents that she was just having some temporary car trouble and using ride-sharing services while it was in the shop. Her voice got smaller and more ashamed when she admitted the real kicker that made everything so much worse. "My parents have no idea about any of this. They think everything in my life is still going perfectly. Actually, it's worse than that," she continued. "They keep asking me for financial help with things, and I don't know how to tell them I can't afford it anymore." That's when she told me what had really been happening over the past few years, and it explained so much about the family dynamics I'd been observing. Every vacation my parents had taken in recent years, Diana had paid for it. The expensive renovations they'd done to their house, Diana had funded. Dad's shiny new car that he was so proud of, Diana had bought. Even their weekly dinners at expensive restaurants were all being charged to her credit cards. "My parents never explicitly said they couldn't afford these luxuries themselves," she explained. "They just expected Diana to cover the costs as part of her role as the successful daughter. Like it was my duty to fund their lifestyle since I was supposedly doing so well financially," she said. "At first, I thought I was just being generous and showing my appreciation for everything they'd done for me. But now I realized they'd turned me into their personal ATM without even acknowledging what was happening." "Now you're completely broke," I said, finishing her thought. "Yeah," she whispered, "and I have absolutely nowhere to go when they evict me. I should have told her to figure it out herself. After years of watching her look down on me, actively participating in my parents' cruel jokes at my expense, and treating me like I was beneath her in every possible way, I had every right to hang up the phone and let her deal with her own problems. She'd never shown me any kindness or support when I was struggling, so why should I extend myself for her now? Instead, I heard myself saying, "I manage a duplex property on Oakwood Street. The smaller unit is currently empty, and you can stay there until you figure out what you want to do next." The truth was that I didn't just manage that duplex, I owned it outright, along with 4 other properties in my growing real estate portfolio. But she didn't need to know those details, and I wasn't ready to reveal the full scope of my financial situation to anyone in my family yet. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone before she finally said, "Why would you help me after everything that's happened between us? After the way I've treated you all these years?" I thought about her question for a moment before answering honestly. Because I'm not them, Diana. I'm not going to kick someone when they're down, even if they would do the same thing to me. When I hung up the phone, Zoe rolled over and looked at me with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Are you sure about this decision? She asked gently. No, I admitted. But it feels like the right thing to do, regardless of our history. She smiled slightly and squeezed my hand. This is exactly why I love you, Tyler. You're nothing like what they think you are. What I didn't tell Zoe at that moment was that there was a small part of me that genuinely enjoyed the irony of the entire situation. The so-called family disappointment was now in a position to bail out the golden child who had fallen from grace. The supposedly worthless minimum wage Home Depot worker was about to provide housing for the high-achieving doctor who couldn't afford to keep a roof over her own head. There was a certain poetic justice to the role reversal that felt satisfying in ways I couldn't fully explain. The next morning, I got up early and drove over to the duplex to get it ready for Diana's arrival. It was nothing fancy or impressive, just a small two-bedroom unit with dated but fully functional appliances and basic amenities. I had actually been planning to renovate it completely next month before putting it back on the rental market. But Diana's emergency situation had changed those plans temporarily. The place was clean and everything worked properly, which was really all that mattered for someone in her desperate situation. I stocked the refrigerator with some basic groceries and essentials, made sure all the utilities were turned on and functioning, and left a spare key hidden under the doormat so she could get in whenever she arrived. As I was checking the smoke detectors and doing a final walkthrough of the property, I found myself thinking about how dramatically different my life could have been if I had chosen to chase my parents' approval the way Diana had done. If I had spent all my energy trying to meet their impossible standards and expectations, I might be the one calling her for help right now instead of being in a position to offer assistance. The thought made me genuinely shudder at the alternate reality I had managed to avoid. Diana showed up the next day carrying 3 suitcases and looking like she hadn't slept in weeks. For someone who had always maintained a perfect appearance, no matter what was happening in her life, she was an absolute mess. Her usually flawless hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her designer clothes had been replaced with wrinkled casual wear, and her eyes were red and puffy from crying. I gave her the keys to the unit and walked her through the basic features of the place, where the circuit breakers were located, how to work the temperamental shower handle, which windows stuck when you tried to open them. It's not fancy or luxurious, I warned her honestly. Nothing like that condo you had before. It's a roof over my head, she said quietly, looking around the modest space with what seemed like genuine gratitude. That's literally all I need right now. I didn't tell her that the property manager she'd be paying her reduced rent to was actually me. As far as she knew, I was just the helpful connection who had gotten her access to affordable housing during her crisis. I figured the less she knew about my actual financial situation and property ownership, the better it would be for everyone involved. The first day she was settled in, I noticed her sitting on the small concrete patio behind the unit, staring at her phone with a look of intense concentration and frustration. I was stopping by to fix a cabinet door that wasn't closing properly, routine maintenance that I could have easily hired someone else to handle, but I wanted to check on how she was adjusting to her new living situation. Everything working okay with the place? I asked casually as I examined the problematic cabinet hinge. She looked up, clearly startled by my presence. Yeah, everything's fine. I'm just doing some job hunting and application follow-ups. I nodded and went back to work on the cabinet. But after a few minutes of awkward silence, she spoke up again. Hey, Tyler, I know this might sound weird, but could you possibly look at my resume? I feel like I'm missing something important because I've applied to over 20 different positions and only gotten 2 callbacks so far. It was such a surreal moment for me. My entire life, Diana had been positioned as the one with all the answers, the family member who knew exactly how to succeed at everything she touched. Now she was asking me, the supposed family screw-up who couldn't do anything right, for career advice and professional guidance. Sure, I said, trying to hide my surprise at the request. Send it over to my email and I'll take a look at it tonight. Later that evening, I reviewed her resume carefully and objectively. It was certainly impressive on paper top-tier medical school, prestigious residency program, years of experience at well-known hospitals with excellent reputations. But it was also completely generic and forgettable. Nothing about her background or accomplishments stood out from the thousands of other qualified doctors who were probably applying for the same positions. I sent her back a marked-up version with detailed suggestions for improvement. I focused on highlighting specific achievements rather than just listing job duties, quantifying her results wherever possible, and emphasizing unique skills or experiences that would differentiate her from other candidates. These were basic resume optimization techniques that I'd learned through my own professional journey, things she'd never had to think about before, because her career had always been on a fast track until it suddenly derailed. "This feedback is actually really helpful," she texted back later that night. "Where did you learn all of this stuff about resumes and job applications?" "Some of us have always had to work hard for opportunities," I replied simply, without elaborating further. Zoe was naturally skeptical about my decision to help Diana, especially given our family history. "She's going to figure out the truth about your situation eventually," she pointed out during one of our conversations about the arrangement. "You can't keep your real financial status hidden forever, especially if she's living in one of your properties. Maybe she will figure it out," I admitted. "But I'm not ready for that conversation yet, and I want to see how this plays out naturally before I reveal anything more about my business." My parents found out that Diana had moved into a new place within just a few days of her settling in. My mom called first, her voice absolutely dripping with that fake concern she used when she was fishing for information or trying to manipulate a situation to her advantage. "Tyler, honey, I heard your sister is staying at some apartment you found for her," she said, like she was discussing the weather. "That was thoughtful of you to help out." Notice how there was no actual thanks or acknowledgement that I had stepped up to help when they hadn't even known Diana was in trouble. Just mild surprise that I could actually be useful for something important. "Yeah, she needed a place to stay," I said simply, not volunteering any additional information. "Well, your father and I have been talking, and we think she should come stay with us instead," my mom continued. "She needs to be with family during this temporary career setback, not living in some random rental property." I almost laughed out loud at her phrasing. "Did you actually ask Diana what she wants to do?" "Well, no, but we're her parents," she said, sounding offended that I would suggest they needed permission to make decisions about their adult daughter's living situation. "Maybe you should try asking her first," I suggested, and then hung up before she could continue the conversation. My dad called next, taking a much more direct and commanding approach. "Tyler, your mother and I think Diana should be staying with us during this transition period. This whole situation is obviously just temporary, while she sorts out some work-related issues and family should stick together." "Oh, what exactly happened with her job?" I asked, playing dumb to see how much they actually knew about Diana's situation. There was a noticeable pause before he answered. "She's between positions right now, which is very normal in the competitive medical field. Anyway, we have plenty of room here at the house, and it would be much better for everyone involved." "Did she tell you that she wants to stay with you guys?" I pressed. Another pause. "Well, no, we haven't discussed it with her yet, but we're her parents. Of course she'd want to be with family. Like I told Mom, maybe you should ask Diana what she actually wants before making plans for her," I said, and hung up again. What I was piecing together from these conversations was that Diana hadn't told them the full story about what was happening in her life. They knew she had moved out of her condo and was staying in a place I had arranged, but they had no idea she was completely broke, had been unemployed for months, and was facing serious financial consequences from years of funding their expensive lifestyle. About a week later, I stopped by the duplex to fix a leaky faucet in Diana's unit. It was something I easily could have called a professional plumber to handle, but I wanted to check on how she was adjusting to her new circumstances and see if she needed anything else. She was on the phone in the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones, but not quietly enough to prevent me from overhearing parts of the conversation. "Mom, I can't ask him for that," she was saying, her voice tense with frustration and exhaustion. I couldn't hear my mother's side of the conversation, but Diana's responses told me everything I needed to know about what was being discussed. "No, I don't know how much money he makes," she continued. "Yes, I know he's already helping me with rent, but I can't just ask for more." I froze in the hallway, realizing they were talking about hitting me up for additional financial assistance. After years of treating me like I was completely worthless and beneath their consideration, they were now seriously discussing whether I might be a viable source of money for their problems. "Mom, he's a Home Depot employee," Diana hissed into the phone. "He can't just magically produce thousands of dollars. No, I understand that you guys are struggling without my financial help, but I can't just transfer that burden onto Tyler." "Yes, I know I used to help with expenses, but that was when I had a job and steady income," she continued. "The situation has completely changed now." That was all I needed to hear to understand exactly what was happening. I didn't burst into the kitchen or make a dramatic scene about what I'd overheard. I just quietly went back to fixing the leaky faucet and pretended like nothing had happened. When Diana came out of the kitchen about 10 minutes later, she looked startled and slightly panicked to see me still working in the apartment. "How long have you been here?" she asked, clearly worried about how much of her conversation I might have heard. "Long enough," I replied without looking up from the sink. "If they send you to ask me for money, you're out of here immediately. Are we clear about that?" She didn't argue or try to defend our parents' behavior. She just nodded silently and left the room, probably to finish her phone conversation somewhere more private. That night, I told Zoe everything I had overheard, and she wasn't surprised at all by the development. "Your parents have been using Diana as their personal bank account for years," she said matter-of-factly. "Now that she can't fund their lifestyle anymore, they're trying to shift that financial burden onto you instead. The difference is that you can see it coming from a mile away." I mentioned to Zoe that our parents had absolutely no clue that I could actually help them financially if I wanted to. My real estate business had brought in over $18,000 just last month alone, after all expenses were paid. But they were completely oblivious to my actual financial situation because they'd never bothered to ask real questions about my life or take interest in what I was building. "And that's exactly why you're winning," Zoe said, squeezing my hand supportively. "They don't even know who you really are or what you're capable of. They're still operating based on their outdated assumptions about your life." A few days later, I saw Diana coming back from what was obviously a job interview, based on her professional outfit and nervous energy. Before heading into her apartment, she stopped to talk to me briefly. She mentioned that she had made it crystal clear to our parents that she wasn't going to ask me for money, regardless of their financial pressures. They weren't thrilled with her decision, she explained. They couldn't understand why she would rather stay in what they called this dump than move back in with them where they could take care of her properly. The irony was completely lost on them that their idea of taking care of her would actually involve her taking care of them financially once she got back on her feet. I asked Diana what she honestly thought about the living arrangement, and she paused to look around at the modest duplex property. Then she said something that genuinely surprised me. "I'm finally starting to understand why you chose to do things your own way all these years, Tyler. There's something peaceful about living without constantly trying to meet impossible expectations." About a month into Diana's stay at the duplex, my grandparents called and invited me to dinner at their house. "Bring Zoe with you," my grandma said warmly. "And your sister is coming too." Something in her tone made me immediately suspicious about the real purpose of this dinner invitation. "Who else is going to be there?" I asked, already sensing that this wasn't going to be the quiet, peaceful evening I usually enjoyed with my grandparents. There was a pause before my grandma answered. "Your parents asked if they could join us for dinner as well." I almost declined the invitation right there on the spot. The last thing I wanted was to subject myself and Zoe to another evening of my parents' passive-aggressive comments and thinly veiled insults. But then my grandpa got on the phone with a tone that suggested this dinner was more important than I realized. "Tyler, I think you should come," he said seriously. "Trust me on this one. There are some things that need to be said, and it's time for everyone to hear them." When Zoe and I arrived at my grandparents' house, everyone else was already there waiting for us. My parents looked noticeably tense and uncomfortable, like they were preparing for a difficult conversation they didn't want to have. Diana looked absolutely miserable, staring down at her hands and avoiding eye contact with everyone. My grandparents exchanged a meaningful look when we walked in that I couldn't quite interpret, but it definitely suggested they had planned something specific for this evening. Dinner started off incredibly awkwardly, with long stretches of uncomfortable silence punctuated by forced small talk about the weather and current events. My parents kept trying to pull Zoe into conversations, suddenly acting interested in getting to know her now that they had realized she was my serious girlfriend rather than just some casual dating situation. "A bookstore! How quaint and charming," my mom said, looking Zoe up and down like she was mentally calculating the cost of her outfit and judging her lifestyle choices. "I'm sure that's very fulfilling work. Do they actually let you sit around and read books all day, or is there some actual work involved in running a business like that?" Zoe just smiled politely and said she genuinely loved working with books and helping customers find exactly what they were looking for. She seemed completely unfazed by my mom's condescending tone and backhanded compliments. My dad chuckled and added, "Hey, as long as someone in the relationship is bringing in decent money, right?" Then he turned directly to Zoe and said with a smirk, "I bet you weren't expecting to end up dating a Home Depot worker when you first met Tyler. You must really be into charity work and helping out the less fortunate." They both laughed like they had just delivered the comedic performance of the century at some open mic night, I felt Zoe's hand tighten slightly under the table, but she maintained her calm composure. "And how long have you two been together?" my dad asked, still grinning like he was enjoying this interrogation process. 2 years next month, Zoe replied simply. My parents both blinked in surprise, like they had just heard that we were secretly married with 3 children and had been hiding it from them. The fact that I had been in a serious relationship for almost 2 years without them knowing was clearly shocking to their understanding of my life. My mom tilted her head with that fake, concerned expression she used when she was about to deliver an insult disguised as caring advice. 2 years and still going strong. That's really admirable, I have to say. I mean, not everyone would have the patience to stay with someone who's still trying to find his path in life. Then came the inevitable questions about our living situation, which I tried to keep as vague as possible. "We have a place together," I said simply. But of course, that wasn't nearly enough information for their purposes. "East side of town," my mom repeated when I finally gave them a general area. "Oh well, it's nice that you're making it work with what you've got to work with. I'm sure your place has a lot of character and charm. You two must really love each other to make it work under those circumstances." My dad snorted dismissively. Must be that handyman charm of his. Built her some bookshelves and boom, true love for life. Zoe kept her polite smile throughout this entire exchange, but I could feel her grip tighten under the table as my parents continued their not-so-subtle campaign to embarrass and belittle me in front of my girlfriend. After we finished eating, my dad cleared his throat dramatically, like he was about to give an important toast at a wedding or stage some kind of family intervention. I knew immediately that whatever was coming next wasn't going to be anything good for me. "Tyler, we wanted to talk to you about something really important tonight," he began in his most serious, authoritative voice. "As you know, family members need to stick together and support each other during difficult times." My mom jumped right in to continue the tag team approach. "Your sister has been going through what we're calling a career transition period, and it's put some temporary financial strain on all of us as a family unit." I noticed they were being very careful not to say financial strain directly, or admit that Diana was completely unemployed and had been for months. They were still desperately trying to maintain appearances and control the narrative around Diana's situation. "For years, Diana has been incredibly generous with us," my dad continued, looking directly at me like he was building up to some kind of important point. "She's helped us enjoy our retirement years, make some necessary home improvements, and travel a bit to see the world. And now it's time for you to step up and do your part," my mom added, staring at me with an expectant expression. "We've always been there for you, Tyler. We put food on the table, clothes on your back, and sent you to school. Now it's your turn to give back to the family." I almost laughed out loud at the audacity of this statement. I had been completely financially independent since I turned 18 years old. I had worked my way through community college entirely on my own, never asking them for a single dime. But apparently, in their minds, providing basic necessities for a minor child entitled them to financial support from me as an adult. "What exactly are you asking me for?" I said, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. My parents exchanged a look before my dad answered. "Well, we have some significant expenses coming up that we need help with. The house needs a new roof, and your mother's car is having some serious mechanical issues that are going to be expensive to fix. So you want me to pay for those things?" I asked, just to make sure I understood what they were requesting. My mom looked genuinely offended by my direct question. "We're not asking for handouts, Tyler. We're just saying that family members support each other when times get tough. Diana has always understood that basic principle." I glanced over at Diana, who was staring down at her plate like she wanted to disappear entirely. She wouldn't meet my eyes, probably because she knew how ridiculous this entire conversation was. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked simply. My dad didn't hesitate. "About $20,000 would help us get through the next few months comfortably." The room went completely silent. $20,000 from their supposedly worthless Home Depot worker son, who they had spent years mocking and belittling. I set down my fork very carefully and looked directly at my parents. "And you think I have that kind of money just lying around?" "Well, not all at once, obviously," my mom said quickly, backtracking slightly when she realized how unrealistic their request sounded. "But Diana mentioned that you've been doing some property management work on the side in addition to your regular job. Surely you must have some savings built up over the years." I looked directly at Diana, who finally met my eyes for the first time that evening. She looked absolutely ashamed of herself, and I could see the regret written all over her face. "I didn't tell them anything specific about your situation," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "They just wouldn't stop asking questions and pushing for information. I'm sorry. I nodded slowly, then turned my attention back to my parents with a calm expression. Let me make sure I understand the situation correctly. For years, you've made fun of my job and called me a complete failure. You've compared me to Diana at every single opportunity, always making it clear that I was the disappointment of the family. You've belittled everything I've ever accomplished, dismissed my choices, and never bothered to ask genuine questions about my life or what I'm working toward. I paused to let that sink in before continuing. You didn't even know I've had a serious girlfriend for almost 2 years. And now, after all of that treatment, you want me to give you $20,000? Now that's not entirely fair, Tyler, my dad started to protest. But my grandpa cut him off before he could continue with whatever justification he was planning to offer. Actually, I think Tyler's assessment is perfectly fair and accurate, my grandpa said firmly. Everyone at the table turned to look at him, because he rarely intervened in family disputes or took sides in arguments. You and your wife have spent years treating Tyler like he's beneath the rest of this family, my grandpa continued, his voice steady but clearly angry. Grace and I have watched it happen over and over again. We've said our piece about your behavior many times, but you never listened to us or changed how you treated him. My grandma nodded in agreement. You dismissed his work, criticized his choices, mocked his path in life, and made him feel unwelcome at family gatherings. And now you have the audacity to ask for his financial help after everything you've put him through. That's when my dad decided to go nuclear and show exactly who he really was as a person. He looked at me with pure contempt and said, Look, Tyler, it's not like you're married or raising a family or building any kind of real career. You're nearly 30 years old and still clocking hours at Home Depot while playing handyman on weekends for beer money. He gestured toward Zoe and continued, Zoe is clearly a sweet girl, but I honestly don't understand what she sees in a man with no real direction or ambition. At some point, you've got to grow up and do something that actually counts for something in this world. That was the moment I decided it was finally time to reveal the truth. I had kept my real-life secret for years, protecting myself from their judgment and criticism. But maybe it was time they understood exactly who they'd been mocking and dismissing all this time. I didn't flinch or show any emotion. I just looked directly at my dad and said calmly, You want to know something funny, Dad? That duplex Diana's living in? I don't just manage it. I own it outright. My mom's eyebrows shot up in surprise, and I could see the confusion spreading across both of their faces. In fact, I continued, I own 5 properties now. That side gig you mentioned has actually been my real focus for the past several years. Home Depot is just where I go a few days a week for steady health insurance benefits and to keep people's expectations low. My dad's mouth was literally hanging open, and he looked like he was trying to process information that didn't compute with his understanding of reality. Last month, after all expenses were paid, my properties brought in just over $18,000, I said matter-of-factly. That's not counting the equity I'm building in each property or the long-term appreciation value. My current portfolio is worth approximately $1.6 million, with loans against it, of course, but the net worth is still substantial. The expressions on their faces were almost worth the years of ridicule and dismissal I had endured. They looked like they had just discovered that their supposedly worthless son was actually a successful businessman who had been hiding his achievements from them. You know that beater car you're always making fun of and telling me to upgrade? I asked. I keep driving it because it's reliable, completely paid off, and I don't care about flashy status symbols the way you do. I could buy a brand new luxury car in cash tomorrow if I wanted to, but I choose not to because it's not a priority for me. My mom was actually stuttering at this point. But you never said anything about any of this. Why would you keep something so important from us? Because nothing I ever did was good enough for you, I replied calmly. No matter what I accomplished, you found ways to dismiss it or compare it unfavorably to Diana's achievements. So I stopped trying to prove myself to people who were determined to see me as a failure. I built my life quietly on my own terms without needing your approval or validation. And here's something else you don't know, I said, turning to address my grandparents. I've been paying Frank and Grace's rent for the past year, and I've been covering the gap in their health insurance payments so they don't have to worry about medical expenses. My parents' heads whipped toward my grandparents, who were smiling softly and nodding in confirmation. Tyler insisted on helping us, my grandma said gently. We told him we were managing fine on our own, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. He's been taking care of us without asking for anything in return. And there's one more thing you should know, my grandpa added with a slight smile. Last month, we made Tyler the trustee of our entire estate. He makes all the financial decisions for us now, and whatever's left when we're gone will go where he thinks it should go. If my parents looked shocked before, now they looked absolutely thunderstruck by this revelation. What does that mean exactly? My dad demanded, his face turning red with anger and disbelief. It means, my grandpa said calmly, that Tyler is in charge of our finances and our legacy. He's the one who actually takes the time to check on us regularly, help us with problems, and treat us with respect and kindness. This is completely absurd, my dad said, slamming his hand down on the table. We're your children. We should be the ones handling your affairs and inheriting your estate. And Tyler is our grandson who actually cares about our well-being, my grandma replied firmly. When was the last time you came by to visit us without needing something from us, Robert? My mom turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between confusion, anger, and what might have been genuine hurt. You've been hiding all of this from us for years. Why would you do something like that? I looked at her steadily and said, Why would I tell you? So you could ask for money sooner than you already have? So you could pretend to be proud of me only after discovering I'm financially successful? So you could take credit for achievements you had nothing to do with and actively discouraged? I shook my head. No thanks. I learned a long time ago that your love and approval come with conditions and price tags attached. Then I said the words I'd been holding back for years. The ones that had been building up inside me through every insult, every dismissal, every cruel comparison. It's funny how you always said I'd never amount to anything meaningful in this family. And now, as it turns out, I'm the one who signs the checks and makes the financial decisions. My dad stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is absolutely ridiculous. You've somehow turned my own parents against me and manipulated them into changing their estate planning. No, my grandma said firmly, her voice carrying more authority than I'd ever heard from her before. Your behavior toward your son did that all on your own, Robert. We've watched you treat Tyler terribly for years, and we're tired of pretending it's acceptable. My mom turned to Diana, clearly expecting her to jump in and say something in their defense, to restore some kind of balance to this conversation that had spiraled completely out of their control. But my sister just looked at them with tired, sad eyes and said softly, They used me too, Mom. They turned me into their personal ATM and made my worth as a daughter dependent on how much money I could provide for their lifestyle. My dad's face went from red to purple. Used you? We supported you. We bragged about you to everyone we knew. We sacrificed everything to give you the best education and opportunities. You paraded me around like a trophy, Diana interrupted, her voice growing stronger as she finally found the courage to speak her truth. And then you expected me to fund your retirement and entertainment because I was supposedly doing so well financially. You never once asked if I was happy or fulfilled. You never asked if the pressure was destroying my health and my marriage. My dad started sputtering about ungrateful children and everything they had sacrificed over the years, while my mom dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, clearly going for the sympathy angle and hoping someone would feel sorry for her position in all of this. But neither of them was actually listening to what Diana and I were trying to tell them about our experiences growing up in their household. I think we're done here, I said, standing up from the table and reaching for Zoe's hand. Thank you for dinner, I said to my grandparents, genuinely grateful for their support and for creating the opportunity for this confrontation to finally happen. As Zoe and I headed toward the front door, I heard my dad call after me with desperation creeping into his voice. So that's it? You're just going to walk away when your family needs your help? After everything we've done for you over the years? I turned back toward him, one hand on the doorknob, and looked him directly in the eyes. That's exactly what you taught me to do, Dad. You taught me that family members abandon each other when times get tough. You taught me that love is conditional and based on performance. You taught me that some people in the family matter more than others. I'm just following the lessons you spent years drilling into me. After the dinner showdown, I made the decision to go completely no contact with my parents. I blocked their phone numbers, their email addresses, and removed them from all of my social media accounts. No more surprise visits, no more guilt trips, no more fake check-ins designed to manipulate me into feeling bad about my choices. Zoe and I even changed the locks on our place and installed security cameras because knowing my parents' personalities, an unexpected drop-in visit wasn't completely out of the question. Diana stayed in the duplex for a few more months while she got back on her feet professionally and financially. She eventually landed a job at a community clinic that paid significantly less than her previous hospital positions. But as she told me, it was the first time in years that she actually felt like she was doing meaningful work for herself, rather than just performing for an audience. We talk regularly now, not every single day, but enough to maintain a real relationship built on mutual respect rather than family obligation. The dynamic between us has completely flipped from what it used to be. She listens to my advice, asks for my perspective on important decisions, and genuinely respects what I've built for myself. We're not best friends or anything like that, but there's finally peace between us for the first time since we were kids. As for my parents, after I completely cut them off, they tried going through Diana to act as a mediator and get me to reconsider my decision. She shut that down immediately and told them flat out that I was done with their toxic behavior, and they had no one to blame but themselves for the current situation. My dad apparently had a complete meltdown when he discovered that I had transferred the power of attorney and trustee responsibilities from my grandparents' estate to a lawyer, effectively locking him out of any access to their assets or decision-making processes. The financial control he thought he might eventually inherit was now completely out of his reach. My parents aren't doing well financially without Diana bankrolling their expensive lifestyle. They're finally starting to experience what it's like to actually live within their own means, instead of relying on their children to fund their entertainment and luxuries. They had to cancel their planned European cruise, sell my dad's new car, and make some serious adjustments to their spending habits. I heard through my aunt that they were even looking into reverse mortgage options for their house, trying to extract equity to maintain their previous standard of living. But honestly, that's not my problem to solve anymore. They made their choices about how to treat their children, and now they get to live with the natural consequences of those decisions. The last communication I ever received from them was a group email with the subject line, "Family is forever." It contained 2 paragraphs of emotional manipulation, half-hearted apologies mixed with justifications for their behavior, and a classy little jab at the end that said, "We raised you better than this, Tyler." I didn't respond to the email. I just archived it and poured myself a cup of coffee in my workshop while looking over the blueprints for my next property acquisition. It's funny how much clearer your definition of success becomes when no one is constantly telling you what it should look like or comparing your achievements to someone else's. There's one more detail about this whole situation that I think perfectly captures the irony of how everything turned out. Remember that family achievement wall my parents had created in their hallway? The one that was basically a shrine to Diana's accomplishments with just my lone high school graduation photo thrown in as an afterthought? Well, my grandparents decided to create their own version, but with a completely different perspective on what constitutes real achievement. They replaced about half of Diana's medical school photos with other family memories that actually mattered to them. Now there's one photo of Diana in her scrubs looking genuinely happy at her new community clinic job, and right next to it is a framed picture of me standing in front of my first building with a sold sign prominently displayed. My grandpa framed that photo himself, using his old carpentry skills to build a custom frame out of reclaimed wood. He told me it was important to him that my achievements were properly recognized and displayed, since my parents had spent so many years dismissing everything I'd worked to build. If there's a moral to this whole story, it's probably this: bet against the quiet ones long enough, and eventually they'll stop playing by your rules entirely. They'll build their own scoreboard, create their own definition of success, and prove that your judgment was worthless all along. Don't underestimate the people you've written off, because they might just surprise you in ways you never saw coming. The kid you mocked for working at Home Depot might actually own the building you're renting. The family member you dismissed as directionless might be the one making 6 figures while you're struggling to pay your bills. My parents spent years convinced that they knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of achieving. They never bothered to look deeper, ask real questions, or take genuine interest in my life and goals. They were too busy comparing me to Diana and finding me lacking to notice that I was quietly building something significant on my own terms. Peace out, Tyler, your friendly neighborhood disappointment who also just hit 6 figures in monthly revenue this past quarter. But hey, what do I know? I still drive that same reliable Toyota Corolla. Update. For those asking about Diana, she's doing much better now. She found work that actually fulfills her instead of just impressing other people. She's rebuilding her financial stability slowly but surely. And most importantly, she's learning to live for herself rather than for our parents' approval. Sometimes hitting rock bottom is exactly what someone needs to figure out who they really want to be. As for whether I'll ever reconcile with my parents, that's entirely up to them. They know where to find me when they're ready to have an honest conversation about how they treated their children. But I'm not holding my breath, and I'm certainly not going to compromise my peace of mind waiting for an apology that may never come. The business continues to grow. Zoe and I are talking about getting engaged next year, and I'm looking at expanding into commercial properties. Life is good when you stop trying to prove yourself to people who were never going to be proud of you anyway. Thanks for reading, and remember, never let anyone else define your worth or determine your path in life. Sometimes the best revenge is just living well and being genuinely happy with the choices you've made.